Hello, I'm Bob the Bookerer and welcome to my channel. Today I wanted to just do a quick recap of the books I've read this week, and as you may have seen from my Booker long list video, I've now finished reading that long list, and the individual reviews are coming shortly, but I really loved the experience of reading the long list. I think towards the end I was a little bit tired and probably was a bit burnt out by sort of required reading and all of that kind of jazz, but this week kind of two of those were ones that I finished as well. So Glory by No Violet Bulawayo and The Seven Moons of Mali Almeida by Shehan Karan Atalaka, and I'll be doing separate reviews of these sort of anyway, but just to say I really greatly enjoyed them both. I think Glory is just such a clever book in terms of how it recreates or sort of reattempts the like Animal Farm kind of approach to sort of talking about political events, and I think it's just such a sing-songy, playful, interesting book as well around that. So really enjoyed the experience of that, and then also The Seven Moons of Mali Almeida, which I sort of hit a bit of a slump with in the middle and was really struggling with, but then found the last 50 pages or so just breathless in terms of how incredible they were. So I have a really bizarre sort of, well, I don't quite know how to sit with this book and feel about it, but basically overall really enjoyed this and think it's an incredibly strong book. So yeah, those are two more books, but let's get on with some of the other books that I read this week. So continuing with a different book prize, I read Regenesis by George Monbiot, which has been shortlisted for the Wainwright Prize for nature writing. This one I think actually maybe for this is for global conservation. And in this, the central argument that George Monbiot has is basically imagining a world without farming, which sounds quite radical at first, but actually he sort of has built the sort of research around it and really thinking carefully about what imagining a new future could look like. And in the future, he supposes a lot of the sort of the way that the world might be shaped is somewhat different. So, for example, either looking at things like lab-grown meat or sort of other meat substitutes that kind of can be created in that way, or people sort of adopting more of a plant-based diet. His argument being that much of the grain and sort of like soybeans and things like that we grow, actually a lot of that ends up being fed to animals, which we then eat. And so his sort of central argument is also that actually that's quite a wasteful process. If we're looking at, food security and many other things sort of globally. And I mean, I just love George Monbiot anyway, so probably not too much of a surprise that I adored this book, but I also I love his bold approach to things. He really carefully thinks about the various problems and challenges we have facing us as a both as a nation in the UK, but also sort of societally, in terms of the whole world, and how we might be able to approach various things around that. So I really enjoyed this. I thought this was so clever, so biting, but also is told with this sort of humour to it that I really enjoy about George Monbiot, where you can just hear him making a little joke in the background every so often, which I really appreciate, because they are a little bit dad joke-like at times. So yeah, all good. Next, a very different book indeed. This is I'm Glad My Mum Died by Jennette McCurdy. And I have to admit, I didn't really know much about her prior to this book. She used to be on iCarly, which I definitely was too old to watch, so missed entirely. I pretty much only know it for that one like meme, which I think is from iCarly actually. Maybe it isn't. Anyway, and in this, Jennette McCurdy really powerfully writes about her experiences of growing up, of being a child star in Hollywood, and the toll that takes. What kind of things need to happen, what kind of sacrifices need to happen to have somebody be a child star. And in Jennette McCurdy's case, she has a particularly tricky relationship with her mother, hence the title of this book. Her mother being someone who really pushed her to not only be the star and try out for these things that Jennette didn't really want to do, but also in many ways, led to some really deeply unhealthy habits in her life as well. So around eating disorders, around a really complicated relationship with food and her body, in terms of some really strict rules that sort of governed a lot of how she lived her life, and also just, you know, around the religious sort of background to some of that as well, sort of growing up in a Mormon church where there was also a lot that where, you know, you don't do certain things because that might, you know, shame the community in some ways. So she sort of grows up in this almost like panopticon of everybody looking at her and having opinions about her and her body and everything else. And actually this book is so beautiful, I think, in charting her sort of downfall and then that sort of regrowth of her sort of putting her life back together, going to therapy, really addressing some of the deep-seated issues she has. And she's incredibly candid about, you know, her early days of therapy, where she does not want to hear any of these things. She sees her mother especially as perfect, and she doesn't want to hear anything against her. But I think this is just such a beautiful book, and I really do urge you to check it out if you can. I obviously will say, as you probably guessed from everything I've spoken about, lots of content warnings about various things. If that's something that would, you know, would sort of not sit well with you, you know, absolutely fine, obviously not to read that. But I think it's a really powerful book. And if you can as well, you know, the audiobook is on Scribd and I think on a few other places. I'd really recommend checking that out because it's really well done. And, you know, she delivers it herself. Yeah, it's a really, really powerful book. Next up, I read a Booker Prize book that wasn't from this long list, and that was The God of Small Things by Arundhati Roy. And I'd previously read her other novel, The Ministry of Utmost Happiness, which I really enjoyed. There's something about Arundhati Roy's voice in that book that I just found really compelling, and I found the same with The God of Small Things. This largely talks a lot about a family, but it largely also talks about the kind of intersections with that family and Indian society in a way that I thought was so interesting. There are two twins at the heart of this book, and we basically learn a bit more about both of them. And I really enjoyed this. I think, you know, it wasn't necessarily a 5-star read for me, but there was so much that I found so gripping and interesting for this, and to let the audiobook sort of wash over me as well, I think was the perfect way to approach this book for me personally. It was just so fun. I think it sort of is very much about like the everyday of society and then that interacting with politics, but then there's also something quite magical about it, kind of in the way that I had with The Ministry of Utmost Happiness, where it makes a sort of a really interesting political point and then just gets really excited by telling a story and by sort of being able to sort of soar and go over here and talk about kind of more fanciful things, and then come back and talk about the everyday. So I see why this won the Booker in '97, which is 25 years ago now, which is wild. And you may sort of notice I've been reading a few other Booker winners recently, partly because, you know, my challenge to read all the Booker winners and shortlists is still ongoing. But also, I think with, you know, 2022, we're in Booker season right now, I was really excited to see what happened sort of 5 years ago and 10 years ago and 20 years ago and all those sorts of things. So, yeah, a really interesting book. And I think, if I'm right, she's only written, I think, 2 novels, but she has sort of had quite a lot of political writing in terms of essays and various other things that I really want to check out, because I just find Arundhati Roy such an interesting person. Just there's a real sort of direction to her writing. There's a real sort of focal point, and sort of that I've been really enjoying. Next up, I read All the White Friends I Couldn't Keep by Andre Henry. And this is a book sort of largely about the author himself, Andre Henry, who was sort of very involved in various sort of struggles for racial equality. And he writes really interestingly, I think, in this book about how, you know, various parts of his identity and various parts of his thought process kind of came together. So, you know, he developed how his thoughts on being a black man in America, how they changed, how, you know, he sort of previously had very different thoughts about sort of some of the causes of and sort of solutions, as much as that's the thing, solutions to sort of racism around him, and how actually that changed where, you know, in a lot of activist spaces he was in, or a lot of social spaces he was in, there were white people who just couldn't engage in a way that he really needed. And so hence the title of the book, that there were many white friends along the way who he just couldn't keep for whatever reason. He gives an example of a friend who says something along the lines of, well, you know, not all slave traders were or enslavers were bad. And he, you know, Andre Henry picks him up on this and is like, sorry, what? You know, even in the very rare example that this person was doing everything, you know, by the book and was really nice, there is still a hierarchy here where someone has been enslaved. And so it's quite an interesting book. I will say, I think some parts of this book felt a bit more like there were some sort of, he kind of wanted to even the score with certain people a little bit, which I think did detract from his overall message. But I think overall, I think there's a lot in this book that I found really interesting and really engaging as well. And he talks a lot about his sort of reconciliation, I guess, later in his life with his race and his sort of cultural background as having Jamaican family members, but also around religion and how he sort of squares that as well within himself. And last but not least, I read Refusing Compulsory Sexuality, which is by Sherronda J. Brown. And this is a book that writes around the intersections between race, sexuality, and particularly asexuality in this as well. So this book, I think, is really interesting for examining a lot of different things in that don't at first seem like they could sit together, but actually finds a really interesting bit of common ground. So for example, it talks about how in a culture where there are certain stereotypes placed on people from different races about sexuality, that has a massive effect on how asexuals may then sit in that space. So for example, if black men and black women are over-sexualized by the culture, what does that mean for someone who's black and asexual, who then struggles to articulate who they are within society? How does that also then look when we talk about various other policies that are introduced, or the way that sort of white supremacists might talk about, you know, the need for certain people to have children to maintain a sort of status quo, and these really grim things. How does that then affect actually asexual people within that? Because we've then got a cultural expectation that certain people should be having sex and giving birth, but other people shouldn't be, and that sort of all plays in together. So I think this is a book that I got as an advance copy, and part of the reason I requested it was because I just sort of thought this is something entirely outside of my sort of frame of reference or like understanding, and I was really keen to sort of learn a bit more about this. And I think it's a really quite accessible book. It's very academic in parts, I will say, but is also very accessible in many other ways as well. And it comes out in September, and I just think sounded like a really interesting book. So yeah, I enjoyed reading that. So that's been quite a varied set of books for this week. Quite a weird mix. In many ways, I don't think I noticed the weirdness of how the other things connected, because I was mostly in booker mode. And I'm now really looking forward to the fact that I'm not just reading booker books for the next few months. I mean, I probably still will end up reading quite a few old ones from the shortlist, but I have a little bit more flexibility, at least for a bit. I will be reading a lot of nature books for the Wainwright Prize. I'll also soon be delving in a bit to the Polari Prize. But that aside, that small thing aside, and the BookTube Prize and some advanced copies, I'll be reading other things. So I'm really excited for that. And thank you as well for people who have given really amazing book recommendations over recent weeks and months. I have my library kind of reservation list is kind of currently what is sort of propelling my new reading. So many of those are kind of going to slowly feature in future videos as I go and read all of them as well. Anyway, I've been Bod the Booker, talking about what I've read this week. I hope you've had a really good reading week. I hope you've had a good week overall. And take care, and speak to you all soon. Bye bye.